The last thing you expect from four of the world's most accomplished high-altitude mountaineers is for them to be dying, not struggling, not in danger, dying. Yet, on the night of January 15th, 2026, somewhere above 24,600 feet on the south face of Makalu, that is precisely what was happening. They had already done the thing that almost no one does in January. They had reached the summit, they were heading home, and then the mountain stopped letting them. These were not people who wandered into something they did not understand. Every one of them had spent years, in some cases decades, learning exactly what the atmosphere does to the human body at extreme altitude, and how to stay alive inside that knowledge. They moved with discipline, they read conditions, they made the summit push in winter, which alone puts them in a category most climbers never reach, and they stood at the top of the fifth highest peak on Earth. There was every reason to believe they would make it down. There was just one problem: they did not make it down. From the desperate descent in darkness to the decisions made in the final hours before contact was lost, this is the story of what happened on Makalu in January 2026, the climbers who went to the summit, the mountain that had other plans, and the question no one in the high-altitude community has stopped asking since. At what point did survival become impossible? And did anyone know when that moment passed? What's next is not easy to watch. Most people have never heard of Makalu, and that is not an accident. It does not appear on aspirational bucket lists. It does not feature in glossy expedition documentaries shot in flattering light. What it has, instead of fame, is a death rate. For every 100 people who successfully reach its summit, 13 die trying. Everest, the mountain that absorbs almost all the public attention, sits between 1 and 2%. Makalu kills at 5 to 6 times that rate. It is the fifth highest mountain on the planet, standing at 27,838 feet. And it earns those numbers through technical difficulties, brutal weather, and a remoteness that means when you need help, help is very far away. In winter, everything gets worse. The winds on Makalu in January have been measured above 125 miles per hour. To feel what that means, picture standing at the open door of a car, traveling at highway speed, and trying to hold your body steady. Now, put that at 25,000 feet, in the dark, on ice, while your brain is running on roughly a third of the oxygen it needs to function. Temperatures fall to minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen equipment freezes. Regulators ice over. The gear that exists specifically to keep a person alive simply stops working, and the person has to solve that problem while their body is already shutting down one system at a time. As of the start of 2026, only one expedition in recorded history had ever summited Makalu in winter. That was in 2009. Before that single success, 13 different teams had tried and failed or disappeared. In 2006, Jean-Christophe Lafayette, 11 8,000ers climbed, a lifetime of accumulated experience, went to Makalu alone. In January, he never came back. His body was never found. The mountain does not distinguish between the careful and the careless. It keeps what it takes. The expedition leader for the January 2026 attempt was Seinu Sherpa. If that name means nothing to you, let me put it in context. Seinu is the only person in history to have summited all 14 of the world's 8,000ers twice. Not once, twice. More than 40 summits of peaks above 8,000 meters. A guiding career built not on marketing or luck, but on the kind of judgment that can only be accumulated through thousands of hours at extreme altitude, through making the hard calls, through knowing what to do when the situation stops matching the plan. Clients requested him specifically. His name meant something in the community that does not impress easily. He was, by any measure, one of the most capable people alive for this particular task. His younger brother, Phurba Ongel Sherpa, was on the team. He was 43 years old, and his record sounds invented until you check the documentation. 19 successful summits of Everest. He had climbed K2. He had guided on Annapurna, Manaslu, Cho Oyu. He had spent his adult life at extreme altitude, building an instinctual knowledge of dangerous terrain that takes decades to develop. Think about the number 19 for a moment. Most climbers who have stood on top of Everest once consider it the defining achievement of their lives. For Phurba, it was something he had done with enough regularity that it had become, in a particular sense, familiar. The fourth member of the summit team was Lakba Rangji Sherpa, an experienced guide who would work alongside the brothers. The third climber, the paying client, was a 42-year-old Iranian named Abolfazl Gozali. If the word client suggests someone who bought their way onto a mountain, set that aside immediately. Gozali held the Snow Leopard Award, one of the most demanding achievements in high-altitude climbing, requiring the summit of all 5 former Soviet peaks above 23,000 feet. He had done that. In 2023, he climbed Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain on Earth, without supplemental oxygen. Most climbers cannot function at that altitude even with bottled oxygen flowing constantly into their lungs. Gozali went up breathing the thin air that exists at 27,940 feet, containing roughly a third of the oxygen present at sea level, on the strength of his own lungs alone. He was there because he had earned every meter of it. What connected all 4 was a shared and specific failure that none of them had been able to put down. Sanu and Phurba had been on Makalu the previous winter. They had climbed to 25,900 feet, close enough to see the summit clearly. And then the wind came in at 80 miles per hour, and that was the end of it. They descended because descending was the right call, and they were professionals who made right calls. But that is not the same as it being easy. That kind of failure stays. Gozali had been on that same 2025 attempt. Despite everything he had achieved in the mountains, he had never once completed a winter ascent of a Himalayan 8,000er. For a climber at his level, that absence is not something that fades with time, it sharpens. So, the team that arrived at Makalu Base Camp in late December 2025 was not a random assembly of ambitious people hoping for luck. It was a group of deeply motivated professionals carrying a failure they intended to correct. And that kind of motivation is a dual-edged tool. It is what pushes people through moments when stopping would be easier. It is also what quietly erodes the judgment that keeps people alive. By January 13th, the team had pushed to Camp 3 at 24,300 feet. This was fast, unusually fast. A standard acclimatization approach to an 8,000er in winter typically involves 6 to 8 weeks of careful adaptation, moving up and coming back down repeatedly, fixing ropes on the technical sections, establishing a Camp 4 as a final staging point. This team had done very little of that. They had not established Camp 4. There were no fixed ropes on the upper sections of the route. Their reasoning was not irrational. On Makalu in winter, speed is its own form of safety. Every extra hour spent in the death zone is an hour during which the body consumes itself irreversibly. Moving fast reduces exposure time. Think of it like running through a burning building instead of walking. The fire is still there, but you spend less time inside it. It was a calculated risk, made by people qualified to calculate it, but it left no margin whatsoever. And then, the weather moved. Sitting at Camp 3, the team received word that a serious storm was approaching. They had to decide immediately. Descend to base camp and wait. Rest, acclimatize properly, try again when conditions allowed. Or launch their summit push that same night, climbing from Camp 3 at 24,300 feet to the summit at 27,838 feet and back, before the storm arrived. Both options had genuine arguments for and against them. Can you imagine sitting in that tent, carrying a year of failure, with the summit 3,500 vertical feet above you and a 24-hour weather window closing around you? The case for waiting was sound. So was the case for going. Winter weather windows on the Himalayas are extraordinary rarities. You could wait 3 weeks for another one that never comes. You could wait until the season ends and go home the same way you arrived. There is a psychological mechanism that researchers have documented in high-altitude climbers, and it applied with particular force in this moment. It is sometimes called summit fever, though that name understates its grip. What it actually describes is the convergence of sunk cost thinking. I have invested too much to stop now, with the distorting effects of altitude on the brain's risk assessment. At 24,300 feet, your brain is less equipped than it has ever been to weigh those pressures against the objective dangers in front of you. The climbers who have died on the most famous peaks in the world were not, in most cases, reckless people. They were people whose very specific circumstances made a catastrophic decision feel like the correct one. Sanu knew all of this. Every person on that team knew it. And they went anyway. Because the window was there, and they were ready. And this was what they came for. Sanu made the call. They were going that night. They climbed through the dark, no fixed ropes on the most technical sections. Temperatures that made every breath a physical struggle. At extreme altitude, the body is never getting enough oxygen. It manages a permanent deficit, constantly redistributing resources between competing systems. The lungs burn, the fingers go numb inside the best gloves that money can produce. The brain sends a signal that grows louder with every passing hour. Stop. Everything at 26,000 feet is asking for the same thing. The climbers who survive on those mountains are the ones who have spent careers learning to hear that message and move through it anyway. Not by ignoring it, but by having built something stronger than it. These four had that. They had spent their entire adult lives developing exactly that. On the morning of January 15th, 2026, at 10:27 in the morning, all four of them stood on the summit of Makalu. Sanu Sherpa, Phurba Ongel Sherpa, Abolfazl Gozali, Lakpa Rangji Sherpa, the second winter ascent in the mountain's history. For the brothers who had been turned back a year before, within 1,800 feet of that same spot, what they felt at that moment is not something words translate well. For Gozali, who had never completed a winter ascent of a Himalayan 8,000er, despite years of building toward it, this was the achievement his entire climbing career had been pointing at. They had done it on one of the most dangerous mountains on the planet, in the most dangerous season, without the safety infrastructure that most expeditions consider non-negotiable. For a moment, every sacrifice that had brought them there made complete sense. But the summit is not the finish line. Every experienced mountaineer knows this with the kind of conviction that comes from having seen what happens to people who forget it. The summit is the halfway point. You have used approximately half your oxygen, more than half your energy, and all the psychological momentum that was pulling you upward. The descent begins with a body at the outer edge of its limits and a mind at a fraction of its normal capacity, moving through the same dangerous terrain that cost everything on the way up, except now in the other direction, with nothing left in reserve. The statistics are not ambiguous. More climbers die on the descent than the ascent. Getting to the top is extraordinary. Getting home is the only thing that actually matters. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you want more raw mountaineering stories, like and subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts below. See you there. They began the descent. The goal was direct: reach Camp 3, rest, rehydrate, continue to base camp the next day. They had summited in good time, and the weather was still holding. At some point during the descent, the four naturally separated into two pairs. Lakpa moved out in front. Phurba followed perhaps 3 minutes behind. Further back, Sanu and Gozali moved together, roped to each other. Standard practice on big mountains. Everyone gets down at their own pace. For the first hours, things appeared normal. Exhausted. Of course they were exhausted. But making progress. And then, at around 24,600 feet, Phurba Ongel Sherpa said something to Lakpa that no experienced guide ever wants to hear at that altitude. He said he felt sleepy. I want you to really think about what those two words mean at 24,600 feet after a night and day of climbing. Sleepiness at altitude is not ordinary fatigue. It is not what comes from a long day of exercise. It is a symptom of hypoxia, the condition in which the brain is no longer receiving sufficient oxygen to maintain normal function. It is the brain beginning to shut down. It is one of the clearest and most serious warning signs that exists on a high mountain. Lakpa had spent enough time at altitude to understand immediately what he was hearing. He did what an experienced guide does. He kept Phurba talking, gave his mind something to hold on to. It was working. Phurba was responding. He was still moving. And then Lakpa turned and Phurba was gone. He had slipped on a steep section to the right of the route. One moment, Phurba Ongel Sherpa, 19 Everest summits, K2, decades of experience, was there. The next moment, he was not. 2 seconds, maybe less. When Sanu and Gozali caught up minutes later, they found Lakpa crying, unable to speak. He did not need to. Sanu did not hesitate. His brother had gone off the edge. Somewhere below, Phurba might still be alive, on a ledge, injured, waiting. Every second standing still was a second that might matter. Sanu began preparing to descend. He turned to Gozali and told him to stay on the ridge. He and Lakpa would search for Phurba and return. It should not take long. Gozali told him not to worry. He said he would make his way down slowly on his own. Whether Gozali fully understood what he was agreeing to, alone, at 24,600 feet, no fixed ropes, after nearly 24 hours of climbing, is something that cannot be known. At that altitude, after that level of exertion, the brain's ability to accurately assess risk is genuinely impaired, not as a metaphor, measurably, clinically impaired. A person at extreme altitude can speak, can respond, can appear present and coherent, while their judgment runs on hardware that can no longer fully support it. Sanu believed him. He had to. His brother was below in the snow. They searched for 30 minutes. They found Phurba approximately 650 feet below the climbing route, lying still. From their position, and from everything their combined experience told them, there was nothing left to be done. He had fallen too far and too fast. He was gone. And Sanu Sherpa stood above his brother's body on an ice slope at 24,000 feet, knowing he could not reach him, knowing he would have to leave him there. There was still a client on the ridge above. 30 minutes had passed. They had to go back. When they returned to the spot where they had left Gozali, he was not there. They were not immediately alarmed. The natural explanation was that he had done what he said and started descending. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, they saw him, standing on a flat section of the route, 200 to 300 feet ahead. Upright, apparently stable, they kept moving toward him. When they reached the spot where they had seen him standing, Abolfazl Gozali was not there. You do the math on what that means. A man visible and apparently standing, alive, upright, stable, had vanished from a flat section of descent route in the time it took Sanu and Lakpa to cover a few hundred feet. They pushed down to Camp 3. A support Sherpa had been there all day preparing food and warm drinks. When Sanu and Lakpa arrived and asked where Gozali was, he looked at them blankly. No one had come. They descended to Camp 2 in the dark, arriving close to 1 in the morning. They checked every tent. Nothing. They radioed base camp. Gozali had not arrived. He was not anywhere on the mountain that could be found. By that point, the 3 Sherpas had been active for somewhere close to 36 hours. Their bodies were in a state of breakdown that exists beyond ordinary exhaustion. The muscles consuming themselves for fuel, the organs working harder than they were designed to. And still, they did not stop. They searched through what remained of the night, calling Gozali's name across every section of terrain between base camp and Camp 2, until they had no voice left to call with. They found nothing. In the space of a single afternoon, Sanu Sherpa had lost his younger brother to a fall, and his client had ceased to exist on the mountain without leaving a trace. The theory that emerged was straightforward and devastating. Gozali had been alone, exhausted and hypoxic on terrain, with thousands of feet of exposure on either side of every step. He was a skilled, serious mountaineer. He had climbed Lhotse without oxygen. None of that changes what happens to the human body at 24,000 feet after a night and day without rest. At some point, on some section of that ridge, something gave. His crampon caught wrong, or he leaned into empty air, or his legs offered less than he needed from them. There was no one there to see it, no one to stop the fall, just the mountain and the wind, and a man at the absolute limit of what a human being can endure, alone. Lakpa reached base camp with 8 fingers frostbitten, badly enough to require hospitalization. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. The account that reached the outside world came through a Japanese climber named Naoko Watanabe, who had been at base camp and who told Lakpa's story because he could not bring himself to. Sanu came down carrying a leg injury alongside everything else. The physical damage was the smaller part of what he brought with him. He had gone back to Makalu to finish something he and his brother had started together. He had finished it. He had stood on the summit with Phurba beside him, and then he had come down without him. Here is the part of this story I cannot let pass without saying it plainly. The storm that had forced the team's hand, that had made the rushed overnight push feel not just justified, but necessary, did not arrive when expected. January 15th was relatively calm. The conditions they had been racing never materialized that day. The storm came on January 16th. If they had descended to base camp on January 13th and waited, the mountain might have offered another window, one where Camp 4 was established. Ropes were fixed on the upper sections, and the acclimatization their bodies genuinely needed had been done. Or the weather might have closed entirely, and they would have gone home without a summit. No one can know. That is always the nature of these decisions. You make them with incomplete information in conditions that impair your ability to assess incomplete information, and then you live with what they become. Or you don't. The search that followed was extensive and dangerous in its own right. Volunteers from 8K expeditions and other companies joined without being asked. Sanu went back up, despite the injury and the grief, because he was not ready to stop looking. Teams pushed to Camp 4 on January 20th. 7 Sherpas at 25,600 feet in January searching. At each camp, on each section of route, they found nothing. No gear, no equipment, no indication that either man had passed through. On January 22nd, Makalu Adventure officially called off the search. The terrain, the altitude, the weather, and the risk to the searchers made any further attempt impossible. Phurba Ongel Sherpa and Abolfazl Gozali would remain on Makalu permanently in whatever places the mountain had taken them. Here is what this story refuses to let settle into easy categories. These were not reckless people making careless choices. They were among the most experienced high-altitude mountaineers alive. They had summited. They had done the extraordinary thing they came for. And the mountain took 2 of them anyway. Not on the technical sections, not in the storm they had been racing, but in the calm that followed their success. On terrain described as low angle, on a flat section of a descent route, in the afternoon, under stable skies. And what this story reveals about the system that surrounds these climbs is worth sitting with. The expedition industry that operates on the world's highest peaks runs on a particular economy of pressure. Clients invest enormous sums and years of preparation into a single attempt. Guides build reputations on success. Expedition companies operate commercially. None of that means anyone in this story made a wrong decision for wrong reasons. But every structural pressure points in the same direction, toward the summit, not toward the descent. Sanu Sherpa came home without his brother. Makalu does not care how many times you have stood on Everest. It does not adjust its terms for your record or your experience or the decades you have spent earning the right to be on its slopes. Jean-Christophe Lafayette, 11 8,000ers, a lifetime of skill and survival, went to this same mountain in this same month 20 years earlier. The mountain kept him too. His body was never found. It simply continues being what it has always been. A place where the atmosphere is thin enough to kill a person even when they are doing everything right, even when they have already done the impossible thing, even when they are already on their way home. The second winter ascent of Makalu is real. It happened, it is documented, and nothing that came after erases it. But here is the question I keep returning to, and I think you should sit with it too. When the cost of a historic achievement is paid in the lives of the people who made it possible, who actually owns that history? Sanu Sherpa summited. He also came home without his brother. Abolfazl Gozali reached the top of one of the most dangerous mountains on Earth in its most dangerous season. He never reached the bottom. At what point does a triumph become something else? What these stories keep revealing, if you are willing to look directly at them, is the distance between what we celebrate and what we accept. We build monuments to human ambition, to the people who go to the places no one else will go, who push past the limits that stop everyone else. We do not always reckon honestly with the structure that surrounds them, the Sherpas who make those moments possible, who go up first and come down last, who turn around and climb back into a deadly mountain to search for people they know they will not find. Their names appear briefly, if at all. Their courage tends not to fit neatly into the version of the story that gets told. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.